Guten Morgen. So this is going to be in English, not German. So I'm going to talk to you about symmetry. I'm an architect, so I'm just going to try and bring you guys to my field from the beginning of what symmetry starts with, which is mathematics. So symmetry has a lot of rules. So let's talk about an axis. And the first one is reflectional symmetry. That's when you have an image and it is repeated according to an axis, which could be in any direction, y, diagonal, and everything. Then you have rotational symmetry, which is when you have an image according to a point and it is rotated. So it could be multiplied according to a point. Rotation. Translational symmetry. It's when you take an image and you move it. That means the image is repeated according to a vector, which means a movement. Bear with me. Then we're going into scaling and multiplying, additivity, magnifying. That's how you multiply an image with a different scale, meaning it can be smaller, bigger, double, 3 times, etc. Then we get into exponentials. So an exponential is a number that is to the power of itself, meaning technically if you have 2 to the power of 2, it is 2 times 2 in that sense, 2 times. And so you always have a number to the power of itself. I'm talking of exponentials because that creates a sequence that could then be a logarithmic sequence that we have in Fibonacci spirals and things like that. When you add these rules to an image through symmetry, you get different forms, different results in that sense. So then you get into fractals. And from fractals, it's also linked to a logarithm, it's linked to a multiplication, it's linked to a scale. And this is something that we can then now move into from mathematics into the real world. So there's an anthropologist called Edward T. Hall, and he spoke about the hidden dimension. And the hidden dimension is about proximus. And that means that every person has a psychological and also a cultural limit and barrier of space in between them. So we all are related into this space. There's an energy. And that means that we're living in a vectoral world, which means everything we see is an image that can be always multiplied and moved within this world. And there's a logic to it that also hits our psychology. So when we see nature, we can also notice that there are similar mathematical proportions and rules that are repeated in nature to a certain perfection. And this perfection can be seen from the micro to the macro, from the universe to the shell at the beach. And if we come back into slowly architecture, we have something called descriptive geometry. And descriptive geometry is when you take a certain image and you repeat it in plan and plan, which means you're looking at it from the top, and then you have it from plane, which is from a side. And then using those proportions or visions or views, you can then get a perspective. And this brings me back to the Renaissance times in Italy, where perspective drawing was actually coining the consciousness of European enlightenment and education in that sense. And they noticed that there was a harmony and there was a rule to what we see with depth. And how do you even get to that rule? How do you calculate that rule? So people used objects like this grid that you can see, where you would repeat everything in a grid on the drawing. So it would be perfectly proportional to this perspective. And this was used by artists that mixed art and geometry, and this also highly influenced architecture because you could start calculating views. And when it comes into the calculation of views, we have the Mona Lisa, obviously, from Leonardo da Vinci, and we always wonder why was her smile so mysterious. But it's not really just about the smile. It's about actually the proportions that Leonardo da Vinci used in harmonizing it within the image itself. So there's something called the golden rule, that you see this number 1 by 1.618, that is phi. And that number is being put together by a certain proportion where this length is proportional to that length, which is proportional to all the different lengths in it. And because human beings, when they see things, we have a certain appeal towards this proportion. which is called the golden ratio. And this golden ratio is repeated in everything we see visually, because that's how the human being appreciates beauty. So technically, beauty is a mathematical code linked to symmetry. However, symmetry is based on beauty is based on two elements. There's symmetry and harmony. So symmetry is something that could be mirrored according to an axis or with a certain rule, translational, rotational, multiplication. And then harmony is something that comes with a sort of repetition, a sort of recurring element that we can relate to. If you can see the normal portrait and then the two other symmetrical divisions of the left and the right side of the face, there's something strange. There's something a bit alien, kind of like, doesn't look very normal. And if we're talking about mirroring images, even in reality, we can mirror images through what we see. So when we talk about photography, when we talk about looking at ourselves in the mirror, if we look at the sun, we're looking at the past because it's 8 minutes of the sun before the image hits our eyes through the speed of light. And then from movement, we get into motion. And how can we see this motion in different ways? Motion can be repetitive, and it could also have a harmony. And then it also brings us to different mediums of art that we use today. So photography, this is with an open exposure, and especially in film. So this is a quick thing. Yeah. Maybe you never noticed this line. This is Wes Anderson, who is a film director out of many. And it's not just Wes Anderson that does this. Stanley Kubrick is also a very well-known director that also uses symmetry, perception, and perspective. This can go on for a while. So, the idea is that many people don't realize that in photography, in film, in visuals, in spatial harmony, there's always an axis that's being calculated. So if you start watching movies now and you start looking for these golden proportions, you will start noticing it because it makes it more appealing to the eye. So through this axis and repetition, we can also see it in urban planning, in the sense of there's a certain axis, and there's a certain element of repetition, but something makes it natural, and we have to also understand what that is. So when it comes into patterns, a pattern is when you have a certain image that is repeated to create a certain quadro. A quadro in Italian means a frame. So these patterns are all influenced by different cultures, languages, climates, spices, whatever you want to say. So this is Moresque, that's Byzantine. This is Egyptian, the middle one is Indian, the other one is they call savage tribes. But these are just very generic patterns. And these patterns are repeated in cultures, they're repeated in architecture, they're repeated in art, and it gives a certain identity to a place. But when we're talking about patterns not just in visuals, we also have to think about natural, like life patterns. How do we start giving a rule to a certain pattern that could be influencing our lives, where it's not just a line that can be just drawn, but it's morphologic, it flows, because life is flowing. Life isn't static like an image. Life is real, we experience life. So this is where the architects kind of come into the game here. And I want to talk about Christopher Alexander, where he had this, with many other people, wrote this book called Pattern Language. And they kind of tried to study human psychology through the times, relating it to space and giving certain patterns to certain problems or certain solutions. Meaning a human being is always going to feel a certain way around a fire. The feel of wood is always going to be wood, no matter 500 years ago or 500 years in the future. The feeling of happiness or relaxation when you see the sun coming out, or when it rains, the calm that comes from it, all these things that will never change influence a certain pattern. And these patterns have actually derived different solutions to spatial problems. So each solution has its own pattern, and it creates the language of space that we can relate to. So there are levels of scale, strong centers, boundaries, positive spaces, negative spaces, and all these things can be used to influence design, to influence space, to influence how we feel in these spaces. And it's very interesting because something that is smooth is always going to feel smooth. Something that is rough is always going to feel rough. So how can we use this to our advantage as taking these patterns as key solutions to solving other things? And then I'm going to talk about Utopia. So what is this ideal world? So this is an image by Bruno Taut, and he wrote this kind of during the peak of the post-war in Europe, where he was trying to move away from the whole rational and production, Taylorism and things that was going on. And he was talking about this ideal city in the Alpine architecture, which is in the mountains, made of glass, a glass bubble of perfection that is not linked to the problems of inequality, of war, of warfare and everything. But, okay, how do we get to this utopia? How do we design our cities that are maybe not made of glass, but actually fulfill an ideal for everybody to feel equal, to feel perfect? That's what utopia means in itself. So I'm going to talk about two kinds of societies, broadly. So we're going to have centralized societies, and then I'm going to talk about decentralized societies. So this is actually a very interesting gravure from La Chaux-de-Fonds, and it actually shows a centralized society in the sense that's based on the service of production. So in the middle, you have the directeur that is there for a purpose so that he could monitor all the workers around him. So this kind of working hub is centralized by a point in the middle, where power dictates by having a rotational equilibrium, like the radius is the same for every person. So you're monitored, your boss is in the middle watching everybody. However, this doesn't just come out of the blue. If we go back a little bit more, we can go back to Versailles when we talk about the Roi Soleil in Paris, France. And the fact is that if you see the image of the gardens of Versailles, there's a lot of symmetry in the planning. There's a lot of power related to this order, related to the way you are perfectly placed on this earth. So Versailles was supposed to be the epicenter of France, where the representation of God was in Louis XIV. So how can this power, through the use of symmetry in urban planning, in design, hit the psychology of things? And it does. It does inflict power. It does inflict manipulation. It inflicts control into a certain extent if we talk about a certain scale of buildings. So this is another painting of Paris by the Haussmann boulevards that were opened. And this came out after the French Revolution, because when the French Revolution happened, people were able to team up in the little corners of the medieval city. And this was what created a lot of distrust with the people that were privileged, that were in power. Because if you can't rule the masses because they can gang up against you, another revolution can happen. So having these Haussmann boulevards cut through the city was kind of saying, like in the same way of in the first image of La Chaux by Ledoux, it's kind of like saying you are exposed. We can see everything. There is nothing you can hide from. We are here. We can march. This is order. It's an energy. So it gives a certain psychological energy to it. The fact that you can stand at the beginning of this boulevard and see the end is a bit intimidating, and it's done on purpose. Like a lot of the buildings, even in Germany, like here is the Stadtbibliothek in Munich that you can see over there. A lot of them, for example, they would also, I remember our history teacher telling us about one of the buildings that Hitler used to go to, and they would polish the floor to an extent that when you're walking, it feels a bit slippery, so that you don't feel completely stable. Done on purpose, so that when you are in these spaces, you feel intimidated, you feel this oppression. So this is the kind of alienation of post-war urban environments, that an excess use of symmetry or scale can actually influence people. For example, it's kind of scary. Imagine if you had to go to school in a thing like that. Anyways. And then we're going to talk about decentralized societies. And these are societies that are based on a completely different logic of hierarchy, hierarchia. So this is a string village in Mali where, let me just give some better examples. So this is a very interesting image because it's quite old. We're not very sure if it's still the same today, but this is the Dogon society in Mali also. And it's very interesting because they have a very peculiar cliff architecture. So they build on the mountains, and the mountains have a lot of rocks that have fallen down due to seismic movement. And every hut that you see is a kitchen, and every flat roof is a room for a member of the family, and they all move in between it. Between the huts and the rooms that belong to the father, the chief of the house, or the patriarch, as you want to say, and then the children, and then the kitchen and everything, you have the in-between spaces where the older men that are no longer allowed to reproduce sit and observe, and they're the ones that monitor society. So every member in this society is calculated and has a role, and it's very structured around communal. There are no roads, there are no piazzas, there are no like open spaces. It's all clustered on a mountaintop, but there's a logic to it. And then, for example, this is in northern Cameroon, the Tolek. It's made out of clay, mud structure, and I really enjoy this because in the middle you can see that there's this whole kind of compound that gets enclosed by the cluster of these huts, mud shell huts, but it was actually influenced by termite hills, and the construction technique was influenced by the termite hills. So if we look at it from a micro to a macro scale, it's kind of like observing the raw calculation of nature, how they have been able, how these termites have seen that, okay, we can use this clay, put it in a certain form, and then it actually creates a microclimate within these huts. So the temperature stays constantly cool, no matter how humid or how hot it gets in Cameroon. So these people, over many, many centuries and generations, have been able to observe nature, perfect a certain design that fulfills the community's necessities, and this is when you come into vernacular. And vernacular architecture is seen everywhere in Europe. You can talk about the Trulis in Puglia, you can talk about the mug cells in Cameroon, you can find them in China, in Latin America. You have these vernacular buildings. And I say vernacular because it's been perfected by the people. It's been perfected over generations and centuries by the people living in a certain situation that had to solve a certain problem of survival that created a pattern. And that pattern is perfect. It doesn't need to change because it fulfills its own needs, its own purpose by its form and existence. And then at the end, you can see a 3D printer reprinting the prototype of these sort of toleks, which is interesting because now, in the most advanced stage of architecture in the 21st century, we are now going back to some study of the vernacular, because at the end of the day, it takes only 1% of energy to create one of these huts that it would take you to make it in concrete or brick. And it takes actually no energy at all to remove it, because it's natural. It'll just fade. And this comes to a little discussion I had with my grandfather. He's not around anymore, but he was a quite inspiring architect. And I remember calling him on his birthday, and I was like, oh, you're 80 years old. How do you say happy birthday in Igbo? Igbo is one of the languages of Nigeria, and we are Igbo. And he was like, you know, my dear granddaughter, that word doesn't exist in our culture. And I'm like, whoa, what do you mean? He's like, there is no day that is dedicated to one person. In our culture, you have many birthdays in a year. I was like, whoa, that sounds cool. And he was like, yeah, you celebrate with your classmates the first day you guys went to school. All the mothers that gave birth on a certain day will celebrate a birthday of the day they all gave birth. There's never one day dedicated for one person. And that's how our society works. And that was really interesting because I never thought that you couldn't have a birthday, but you could have more birthdays, and it's based on a completely different set of values, of moral values and cultures that gets repeated from the way people behave and also from the way they build, because it's also decentralized in that sense. There's no king and things like that. So then let's start connecting the dots from centralized, decentralized. What is the ideal town, the ideal city? What's our conclusion from all of this? And I want to just focus on two architects. The first one is Frank Lloyd Wright. This is one of his very famous buildings called Falling Waters in America. And the beauty about Frank Lloyd Wright is that his mentor was Sullivan. And Sullivan was actually trained by the Beaux-Arts in Europe, which is very strict about perspectives and the golden rule and this and that. But Frank Lloyd Wright took that to the next level because his philosophy was look at nature, observe nature, and see that everything in nature has a rule, has a purpose, and out of that function, everything can look similar because it's based on the same rule, but everything is different because everything has a function of itself. And I think something that really is beautiful with his architecture, from the building to the little detail, are the details of the windows, because he works with stained glass. And the stained glass is always linked to a certain proportion, harmony, that is based on a form of studying nature. It's still geometrical, it's still linear, it's still calculated, but there's an element of improvisation that comes into it. And this is what made Frank Lloyd Wright so special in the way he would build, because he really tried to find the particular element that would make it special and break the symmetry from the classical symmetry that would have just a repetition of just geometric harmony in itself. So this is an Inca carpet, very old, and they also had patterns, repetition, lines that follow. But as you can see, there are things that break it. Like if you notice on the edge of the right edge there, you can see there are two kind of squares, then there are four squares, then there are two, then there's a little white one there, and a yellow one there, then the green continuously, that green continuous line gets multiplied by a blue one on top and a yellow one at the bottom. At the end, why didn't they just make it all the same color? Why didn't they just repeat the same symmetry all the way? By breaking it, it makes it natural. By creating a game, it makes it more intriguing for the eye. This is a Persian carpet, for example, from Nepal, carpet. And here you can see that the symmetry here is broken with just the change of color. You can see there's an axis in the middle by a change of color. There's a break in the repetition by forms, by certain surfaces, through repetition also. And these are things that have existed for centuries. So it's always been part of trying to play with symmetry, how you break it. And this brings me to my second and last architect, which is Aldo van Eyck. And he spoke about the Otterlo circles. These are these two interesting circles here. And this comes out of a principle of how to design positive buildings or good design. So in the first circle, by us, which means by us architects, technically, You have three images. The first one is like a rectangle, and that looks like Nike's, the temple, and that represents a sort of classical order. It could be any temple in Greece or anywhere. The second one that looks a bit like this, distill, modern Picasso, deconstructivism, represents the modern and also represents dynamism, like movement in itself. And the last one represents a vernacular city, a city by the people for its own purpose that has been it could be any vernacular city or urban settlement anywhere. So mixing the classical, the modern, and the vernacular by us. Then we move on to the next circle, for us, where you see a whole bunch of people gathered together discussing what to do next. And the problem with architecture is that it's always this division between the by us and the for us. But actually architects are human beings like everyone else. And construction has always been by the people, not by privileged few for privileged few. So as we come into human natures and cultures, individual and collective, this is where we start seeing that merging tradition, merging also the idiosyncrasies of where you live, of what your locality gives you those little elements that create the break of symmetry, that create the beauty of why it's not just purely symmetrical or purely repeated because it functions. It's also adapted through tradition, through reality. And this is how you get to a sort of contemporary architecture that is relevant today. And then you ask yourself, like, okay, I'm Solange and I'm an architect in Switzerland. How do I move about this space, this very rational, conservative almost space? And that's where Matriarchy was created, because I met this lovely girl, Kenzani, at the ETH, and she came from South Africa, and we both merged our ideas about why is it that there's a lack of this vernacular awareness, especially from sub-Saharan Africa, within the academic systems, and what is the space for women of color within this spatial discourse of architecture. And this image actually is a drawing of all these different buildings that are hidden jewels on the African continent. And we wanted to create a sort of bridge between how we could build for the future without forgetting what has been done in the other part of the world, the developing world, the world that has been forgotten by the Eurocentric point of views. So we've now brought into a huge collective. We're more people now, and from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world, and we're all different, like not everyone's an architect, and we all talk about bringing ourselves together and creating a certain energy. And this video will just help explain what we do.
The future is mysterious, but from a decolonial perspective, we are actually trying to invent a future beyond the Euro-North American-centric modernity.
Matriarchy Architecture is an intersectional collective that brings African women of color together for the empowerment and development of African cities within the realm of spatial education.
Matriarchy architecture produces various forms of content that constantly aims at catalyzing and fostering dialogue and knowledge exchange on the need for intersectional space.
We seek to focus recognition of African women in the global spatial and architectural industry, spaces that have often barred us from representing ourselves and presenting a worldview that stems from our world sense.
Matriarchy aims to merge, manifest, and metamorphose in the spatial sphere of design and writing, which currently fails to incorporate diverse identities and visions.
MA seeks to work with established practice and education partners to transform the various sectors related to design and the city, not just for the inclusion of POC women, but for the greater production of knowledge that reflects African ways of being and navigating form.
We are a voice and a nexus, a ripe site of emerging and progressive thinkers of African descent who will inevitably contribute to the future of spatial Africa.
Thank you. Thank you.